time to change the changing propaganda index again. So we got another high inflation reading out, but the more important story, and I've been stressing this for a couple of years now, is the cost of living adjustments that are tied to the CPI or changing propaganda index. Finally, you're starting to see the cost of living adjustments, which are tied to Social Security benefits and also pension benefits for retirement government employees. This was the highest cost increase for cost of living adjustments in 40 years, a 5.9% increase. And this is going to mean many, many billions in increased payouts for the U.S. federal government attached to Social Security. So it is in the government's incentive to underreport on the inflation rate, to underreport on the consumer price index, to underreport and constantly change the changing propaganda index, or CPI, or consumer price index that they officially call it. Take a look at the chart on the right-hand side of your screen. This is the biggest pop in increase in a very, very long time since the stagflation, since Paul Volcker in the 1970s stagflation, and Paul Volcker was hiking interest rates. Except no one can hike interest rates like that because they would crash the entire U.S. economy, the entire global economy, and the Ponzi finance that governments and corporations are all running all over the globe. So you will see new adjustments made to the changing propaganda index. So it is guaranteed because the government cannot afford to pay out hundreds of billions more per year. Unless, of course, the government wants to count that as beneficial to GDP, because the government spending counts the same as private sector spending. And that's why the government spending is at least 50% of GDP, depending upon how you calculate it, but it's headed even higher than that, and it's counted positively as GDP here in the US. That's not really capitalism, where the government is spending 60%, 70%, 80% of all the total spending in the economy. But that is still being counted as positive for GDP. If you are a fan of Austrian School Economics and you know Austrian School Economics, Murray Rothbard argued that government spending should be subtracted from GDP. But the Keynesian cross, which is taught at many universities, teaches that all spending and investment is equal. So all government spending, private sector spending, investment, consumption, it's all equal, it doesn't matter. That is so far from the truth, I don't even know where to start. But there's a bunch of PhD economists here in the DC metro area that either work directly for the government at the Federal Reserve, Bureau of Labor Statistics, other government agencies, or economic think tanks that are on government contracts, or economic consulting firms or other federal government agencies here in the DC metro area, and they are grossly overpaid. They do not get fired for making enormous mistakes. They are making over $70,000 a year with Cadillac healthcare insurance and cushy retirement benefits, and they will be coming up with more and more ways to change the changing propaganda index to underreport the real inflation rate, because it is in the government's incentive to underreport the real inflation rate, because if cost of living adjustments keep increasing at this pace, the government's going to have to pay hundreds of billions of dollars more each year, and it's going to wreak havoc on the government's budget. The Federal Reserve is going to have to monetize even more debt. The Fed won't be able to pretend that it can even taper this Ponzi scheme, and the entire system will unravel much faster than the central planners want it to. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content, research, financial education, and analysis than I provide in these short little free videos, there are now over 180 articles, charts, and audio podcasts behind the paywall, all for the cost of a Starbucks cup of coffee per month, only $5 a month. And just in the last 17 or so weeks, there are 30 new articles out on a lot of interesting topics about global macro companies and sectors. I have to put out a uranium market update this week. I think it will be a combination of an audio podcast and then a written article with some charts. So hopefully I'll get that done in the next couple days. There's been the baseball playoffs. My Dodgers thankfully have not been eliminated yet, although it's been rough going. So if I could wrap up this short little video very quickly, we are finally seeing a big move up in the cost of living adjustments after the CPI numbers and the inflation numbers have kicked in. They cannot hide the rent hikes. They cannot hide the wage increases. They cannot hide the increases in food costs. They cannot hide all the increases in oil prices, all the increases in natural gas. They can't hide all of these price increases with the current CPI formula. It's going to have to be changed. And the cost of living adjustment that just kicked in is the largest one in 40 years. It's absolutely insane. If this continues, it's going to blow an even larger hole in the US federal government budget. The Fed will not be able to pretend that it can taper. The Fed will actually have to monetize even more debt. You have politicians talking about even larger amounts of universal basic income. But with these cost of living adjustments, the government is on the hook for enormous amounts of payouts tied to the consumer price index or changing propaganda index. So it is in the government's incentive to lie. It is in the government's incentive to cheat. It is in the government's incentive to underreport the real inflation rate. And the real inflation rate is double digits. If you look at the Austrian school True Money Supply, which measures base money supply differently than the Keynesian economists at the Federal Reserve measure it, it is up $6.5 trillion in the last 2 or so years. So the Austrian school True Money Supply, or TMS, is up $6.5 trillion, or about a 50% increase in just the last 2 years. So there is a lot of currency and credit sloshing around globally. It's not just the US. You have all these governments doing very similar and stupid policies. There are governments and central banks, lots of debt monetization, lots of currency devaluation, a lot of similar policies to the 1920s and 30s with beggar thy neighbor and stagflate tax lie. On top of wage hikes in many other countries, you have a lot of sectors asking for wage hikes, and that is all starting to be priced into supply chains. So the odds of lower prices for consumers, the odds of beneficial deflation for consumers on many items are very, very low. Look at electricity costs, look at rent costs, look at energy costs, gasoline, food, rent, healthcare. All these things are showing bad stagflation. And unfortunately, I don't see this being reduced significantly anytime soon.